Oh, hello, world. Welcome back to Comic Book News. I'm Dan Shaheen. Today, man, oh, what a treat. We're going to talk to none other than John Jackson Miller from Comichron. What is Comichron, you ask? Oh, man, we're going to get into that because it's not that simple of an answer, but it's suffice it to say, it's a service provided by Mr. Miller that aids the entire industry, from fans to retailers, to publishers, to journalists, and everybody in between. Anybody who cares about actual, objective, truthful numbers in the direct market sales of comic books, they go to John Jackson Miller's data right away. So let's do that too. Without any further ado, I want to introduce a friend and important resource to the comics industry. John Jackson Miller, welcome to Comic Book News.
Hey, glad to be here.
Awesome. I'm just so happy that you agreed to come on here because there's a lot of video content out there that uses your numbers as its source. I mean, you put out a report every month about the previous month's sales of comics, and there is video content out the wazoo about it.
I'm looking for the royalties somewhere. I have not finding them, but that's okay.
Okay. Yeah, right. You're not making a dime off that, but hey, fellas, this is a little thing to you guys out there using that data. That's what the data's there for. Yeah. But hey, how about putting a link back to Comichron and specifically to the month that you are referencing in your video? Just doing that would be a big help to John and a help to the industry. And
well, yeah, the bandwidth is a thing at some point. But yeah, I decided that I needed to do this back in the 90s. I was the editor of Comics Retailer, which was the trade magazine for the comic shops, sister magazine to Comics Buyer's Guide. And I would end up fielding all the calls that Maggie Thompson didn't want, basically, the business calls for the state of the industry. And one of the things that I found out fairly quickly was that the mass media had no clue as to what was going on in comics. We were seeing articles running in Fortune magazine kind of places, for 2 or 3 years after the market collapsed, saying comics are hot, hot, hot. And people were making decisions based on that, and betting their life savings on the comic books that they were going to put out themselves, or the stores that they were going to start, or something like that. And these didn't have any background information. And then, of course, also, the collapse of the early 90s. And this is a long segue that I will not do now, but the crash was not caused by speculation. It was something else. It was actually very much like a real estate bubble. But one of the aggravating factors was that we had this lack of information in the marketplace about how many comics existed, what the supply was. We also had a lack of information about what the real true demand was. We had, certainly we had Overstreet, we had our price guides at Comics Buyer's Guide, you had Comics Values Monthly, and then you had Wizard out there and Hero and all of the other price guide publications. But of course, none of that was close to real time. And nothing really got into, what these sales figures were, what the initial quantity was. And so, as I began to realize that this information was out there, I said to myself, this is valuable information to have. And of course, the other reason that I began collecting it was simply because we had this period in comics. I used to call it the exclusivity wars. It's now really more been, I think, really the phrase distributor wars has kind of taken it over. And that's that stretch between 1994, the last week of 94, and 1997, where Marvel is going exclusive with its own distribution company, Heroes World, and it's not possible to get sales charts from any one distributor that have everybody in it. And so in 1996, I negotiated a deal whereby I could actually merge it all together. The Excel spreadsheet that I'm using today is still called Harmony, because it brings all this together. And I think I just did my 237th one or something like that in a row here in March without missing one since September '96. I got married that month. Now my kids are in college. And I still do these numbers every month. But that is only one part of what's on Comichron. There are other data sets that some are on there, some are alluded to, some are drawn upon, but they go all the way back to the 1930s. And I'm going to have that material out in a variety of places just as soon as I can get to it.
That's exciting news. Another breaking piece of news about comic book here on Comic Book News. So but let me ask you, you talk about methodology. So for a second, before we dive into the numbers, because what are we here for? We're here to talk about Q1 2020 and what a crazy Q it's been. But before we get there, I'm interested in your methodology. I'm assuming that now that there was only one distributor for the past 25 years, or 20 years rather, no, 25, that it became easier as far as where you needed to collect the data from. But it's a little unclear to me what you collect and what you need to compile, because I go, isn't it as simple? Like, couldn't Diamond just publish these numbers?
Well, if they do publish the root table that is, where this all starts every month. And that goes back to Capital City Distribution in October of 1984 in their newsletter called Internal Correspondence, which is the predecessor to the website ICV2, which is Internal Correspondence Volume 2.
Milton Greep, formerly of Capital Cities, now of ICV2.
He realized that there was a need to tell retailers, here is what is selling relative to everything else. Because we had books coming out then. There was a little book in 1984 called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And of course, nobody knew it would be worth a darn. But sold 2,000 copies, original print run. But when it appeared on the charts before then, and there had been distributor charts by Capital before then that had just the rankings and nothing to tell you what anything sold relative to anything else. Well,
it told you relative ranking, but not what the difference was between.
Yeah, it was just an ordinal ranking. And so what he did was he included an order index number, and it said for every 100 copies of Uncanny X-Men, we sold 15 copies of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And then if you were in the business and everybody in the business was doing this, they were taking those charts every month and they were taking the numbers that they knew they were selling into the direct market or that they were selling into Capital. And they were able to reverse engineer their sales, and they were able to reverse engineer their competitor sales. And they were able to reverse engineer the overall size of the direct market. This went on for a long time. Diamond adds numbers, order index numbers to its charts in the early 90s, it's interesting trying to key these two data sets against each other, as I've been trying to do for years. In one sense, it's gotten easy. Because when Capital City went out of business in 1996 and sold out to Diamond, I went down there in my sad Indiana Jones style and rescued, with their consent, Capital City's sales chart or underlying sales data. There's a photo of this in the big book I did from this stuff called the Standard Catalog of Comic Books. And I've run it on Twitter every so often. The index cards that John Davis, the co-founder of Capital, used to write down all the numbers for all the comic sales on. And what I found over the years is, we entered all those numbers into a database. And if you square them up against the Capital charts, they're exact. They are what they say they are. And then it's just a matter of knowing what Diamond sold relative to capital at any moment in time, and you can get that number out of there. And then there's, as I say, there's other sources of data, including internal data from the publishers themselves, that we're able to use to, to square it all up. And when I say we, it's me and the many people over the years who have helped me with data entry. My wife has done a lot of it. My kids have been doing some of it, because there's just a whole lot of material that's out there and is still out there or is in my files yet to be processed and put online. But again, what do we get out of this? We get the history. We get the context. We know, the scale and the scope of past collapses, of past booms. Yes. This is why, I get tagged a lot in the latter half of the 2010s for being too optimistic or not being as panicked about the state of things during the lull that we had in.
I think the words that are thrown around is something like pro-industry shill. Is what I
well. I will always be pro-industry because the absolute the root driving cause behind the website and my work is I want to see that as many people that are involved with comics, creating them, publishing them, buying them, selling them, collecting them, as many people who are employed in that business as are today will be employed tomorrow and next year and 10 years from now. And this has not always been possible over the period we're talking about here, particularly the 90s. And this is what I'm talking about is the scope of the collapse of the 1990s was such that it took down good shops and bad shops alike, strong publishers and poor publishers alike, good distributors and bad distributors alike. It was on a scale much larger than what we saw in the 2017 period and in previous slowdowns like 2010, 2011. We just know that it was bigger then. It was a bigger peak. It was a bigger crash. And it left bodies everywhere in terms of corporate bodies, in terms of shops out of business, publishers out of business. We went for almost 15 years without a new publisher that was able to go past 5 or 6 titles and live. Right. We went from pretty much Valiant to IDW. And everything in between that's a startup company. My friend Mark Patton called it the rule of 8. As soon as any publisher got past 8 titles, it collapsed because they could not leap over that difference between being a small publisher and being and having economies of scale.
So John, clearly, passion motivates this, because if you had not done this, what you have done, forensic data gathering of and everything, one, who could have done it and who would have done it?
No. The thing is, people have been doing it for years, or people have been collecting it for years.
And on the side, I would also like you to touch on how this works in other industries and who does that and who pays for that in other industries, if you could, before, and then we're going to go right into the Comichron 2020 quarterly report.
I would just say to quickly observe on what we did before in this. Fans were using statements of ownership. Let's see, where's the camera here? This comic book earlier today. This comic book came in the mail earlier today. It's a copy of Sad Sack and the Sarge that I've been from Montana that I've been looking for 20 years. And it says that in 1960 they sold 228,391 copies on average of each issue in that year. That's a number that has been in fandom since fandom started, since Maggie Thompson and Don Thompson started doing their own fanzine in 1960, and They've been running in various places since then and collecting them. But until I came along, or rather until I started my own work, nobody had computer spreadsheets yet. Nobody could actually record all that. And it's taken me about 20 years to get almost all of those figures from the comic books. We're down to just the sad sacks of the world. Really, really horrible comics nobody wanted to keep.
So I've always had a question about those kind of numbers, right? Because you see them. I've looked at the Indicia before, and I go, well, isn't it apples to oranges, because those were all sold in a returnable market back then?
Well, they as the years go on, they force them to print more information. So the base number you're seeing there, that 228,000 number, that's how many they sold after returns. So that's actual sold to consumers. It includes sales through newsstands. It includes sales through subscriptions. And then later on, by the late 1960s, they had to print their print run. And so the print run made it possible for us to see, oh gosh, that 228,000 sounds huge. But in point of fact, they were printing 600,000 copies of Sad Sack and the Sarge, more than likely, to sell those 228,000, which meant that more than half of them were going into the dumpster. More than half of them were going in the incinerator. They weren't making a profit anywhere near to the point that you think they were. Yeah, I mean, I think that what changed when the 90s came along, it became possible for people like me to record this stuff and try to bring it all together. And then, to go back to those diamond numbers, they originally were just for the retailers, and they still are just for the retailers. They're published for the retailers. But it happened that the consumers got the information, tried to get the information any way they could because they needed it. They wanted to know how many copies existed of things. They wanted to know how rare something was. One of my most popular pages is the month that Walking Dead #1 came out, because everyone wants to know how many copies there were. It was 8,000 and something, and so there was a demand for this information. And so when I quit the day job to write novels and graphic novels full time and comic books back in 2007, I immediately started Comichron to serve as an archives, preserving this stuff, and to try to give context when things happen, whether it be just a mundane month where nothing has really changed, or whether you've got March of 2020. And
what a segue, John, because now let's talk about the work you've done to chronicle this stuff. We're going to look at your Comichron quarterly report.
Yep.
I'm happy to announce this is the very first appearance of the all-new Comichron logo, debuting right here on Comic Book News.
It's polished up. Comics history by the numbers is the tagline. I had run a YouTube channel for about a year as an experiment, doing these monthly reports. The problem is I have rural internet, so I can't upload anything longer than about 10 minutes in under 6 hours. And also, I just between work projects and other things, it's already very demanding doing the monthly numbers, and frequently I'm at a convention or something like that, and so it's not easy to do. A quarterly report, however, is another story. So cool. What you're going to get here is basically the slideshow that you would have seen if I was doing the monthly report for the first quarter here, and the headline for it. Coming up here is basically before and after. This is a peculiar quarter, as we're going to be looking at the history of things. Yeah. And remember, when I'm producing these reports, I write everything in the tense of somebody going back 10 years from now and reading it. What would they need to know about coronavirus? What would they need to know about the industry at this moment? Everything is in past tense. I don't do anything, if possible, in the actual reports on the website where it mentions something about what might happen a month from now or 2 months from now, because that's going to have its own page, and I don't want to have to go back and update. So,
those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it. You've got a lot of lessons from the past. let's look at how the more recent past plays out, and then we'll try to put it in context to some of those bigger events.
I'd like to look at the last 6 years in sort of 2-year increments, because it kind of rolls up, the ups and downs of just the direct market part of things. We had, as I said, that little recession in comics, much bigger recession in the rest of the world in 2009. In 2011, things turn around with the New 52, and orders through Diamond generally improve through the middle of the decade. Even as digital is coming along, sales for print are going up. And we can look here at the quarterly changes here starting in 2014. 2014, that second quarter there, that's when Spider-Man Homecoming comes out. That's when Amazing Spider-Man #1 comes out with more than 500,000 copies sold. This is also the period where you're starting to get the collector's boxes being a big deal, Loot Crate and Marvel's collector box, those kind of things, adding to the numbers. And you'll see here that through most of the quarters of 2014, 2015, we're just doing gangbusters. The first quarter of 2015, the first quarter is usually not good because it's the winter and people don't publish as much. First quarter of 2015, what happens? Star Wars goes to Marvel. That explodes. Then second quarter 2015, that's when we get Secret Wars happening. So yet another wars thing. And that's a quarter that's up 16% over the previous second quarter, which was already up before the previous year. So, we have a really strong stretch right there. It's very hard to keep that kind of intensity up. And we go on to 2016, 2017. And we see that the next part of the story, next slide coming up here, is that DC does its rebirth, and at the end of 2016, and we start to see things trailing off because the numbers that first rebirth month, we sold 10 million comic books into the direct market. We being Diamond and the publishers. The retailers bought that many. That was a record since the early 1990s collapse. You just couldn't keep that kind of intensity up. 2017, you've got editorial initiatives like Secret Empire that don't catch fire the way the previous ones have, and you see the market beginning to collapse to a degree. Nowhere near to the earlier degrees, as of course I was referring to, but it's not a good year. And another thing that's going on is there's a bit of an adjustment happening with the comic shops when it comes to the platform variants. When you have to buy 100 copies of this to get this particular other comic book. Well. That is a big part of the market. It's a part of the market that we don't really get credit for in the sales charts because those sales happen. That 100 for one comic book usually ends up getting sold within the shop for $300 or whatever the number is. That's on the bottom line. That helps the retailer, but we only see the sales of the comics that actually got to that point. So it's money that's in the stores. But again, the platforms are something which they distort demand. They distort demand for individual issues. There's a place for them, but you always kind of have to fine tune what that is. What levels are too much for these gated variants, so to speak. And it was over the top at that point. There was an adjustment that had to happen, and that adjustment sort of flows through 2017. The third quarter of 2017 is the low point, quarter versus quarter, down 16%. These are all down versus the previous year, not down versus the previous quarter.
Let me stop it for 1 second, John, and ask you, do you think that data like this comic had a match to incentive tied to it? Like, does that deserve an asterisk in the Comichron so that people understand what might have caused in that?
In the top 100 comics every month, 95 of them have variants. So
but I mean the ones that are, I don't specifically mean the ones that have variants, but the ones that are like match this one to a previous order, which was matched to another one and causes dramatic inflation in a base title in order to score a variant. How do we reflect that for historical?
If the job of the chart was to act as a scorecard, saying who's in first, who's in second, who's in third, and to try to get at actual real rank demand like that, that would be different. The job of the chart is to tell the retailers what commodities are on the market. It's a commodity report. The retailers need to know how many copies of Uncanny Superperson 4 are on the market. It does not matter that this many were bought in order to get this thing here. We're talking about initial supply. We're talking about giving the retailers the ammunition that they need to be able to say, hey, this particular comic book, it's somebody has brought into the shop. It's one of 250,000 or however many like that, and it honestly doesn't matter at that point how they got to that 250,000. And for Comichron's readers 20 years from now, presuming the site is still there, whoever is running it, it won't matter then.
The reason it matters to me a little bit, I think, is because it seems like there is now then a break between what used to be, you could logically say this many copies sold, so you could sort of infer from that how many people were reading that comic. Yeah, and that seems to me utterly.
You've never been able to do that. You've never been able to do that. Well, for one thing, comic books have a very high pass-along readership relative to other magazines. If you go back in the advertising kits for Marvel and DC and Harvey and all those other companies, they were claiming at some points that every one comic book had a pass-along readership of 8 or 9 or 10. So that the real readership is 10 times higher. So the number of copies sold is never ever going to be an adequate measure.
Agreed. I mean, and then you can even extrapolate that to the next level and say, hey, library sales. Each library sale might represent hundreds of readers.
Again, one of the challenges has been that the data is having to. Or this one data set from Diamond is having to serve multiple, roles now. Again, it does need to be for the retailers first and foremost. But, at the same time, there are ways we can pull at it and see what's really going on. One of the things
I didn't mean to rabbit hole us there.
No, it's okay. No, one of the ways that, for example, you can see whether a comic book has been either deep discounted are overshipped is by looking at the sales rankings. On the left column, you'll see the unit sales. On the column next to it, you'll see the dollar sales. The dollar sales are not simply the number of units times the cover price. The dollar sales ranking actually is ranked based on invoice dollars, which is what the retailers paid Diamond. And so you can see pretty quickly if two comic books are ranked right next to each other, 21st, 22nd place, and but their dollar rankings, even though they have the same cover price, their dollar rankings are like 100 points apart or 100. That much lower dollar ranked book probably had a huge overship or a huge discount or something that helped it that Diamond did not get money for from retailers. And so
that's a clue. That's an interesting signal.
That's a clue. And that I actually explain to people in the article that goes along with the charts. I know everybody wants to get straight to the scores on the sports page. They don't want to read the article. Back in the, I keep using these newspaper metaphors. I'm an old newspaper guy. People want to go straight to the bottom line, but the fact is, the context is often in the article, where I do go through every month usually, and try to say, okay, yeah, look, this asterisk means that this book was returnable. And it's taken Diamond has given it a haircut of 10% before it even goes into the charts. These comics we can identify are more than likely the beneficiaries of an overship. And by the way, everybody thinks these are controversial. These things are almost never ever done to pump a book's numbers up. That's not what they're for. The overship and the and partial returnability are two sides of the same coin in terms of being two strategies for trying to find the maximum interest level of a comic book. DC actually did the first work with overships, where they did an index test, a saturation test, if you will. They shared the data with me for that in 2002, where what they did is they basically took a handful of stores and they sent them double their orders at no cost. And in exchange, they were able to calculate what they were able to sell. And what retailers found was they were on average, they sold about 25% of those comics. Now some books, they sold almost everything. Some books, they sold almost nothing. But that was their way of testing to see how much retailers were undershooting demand with their orders. And what DC
I'm sorry, are you saying, clarify for me though? Are you saying they sold 25% of the additional overshipped books?
Yes, average? Yes, on average of the additional books. Yes, they were able to sell 25% of that material. But
clearly
some of those,
pointing that retailers are under ordering.
In 2002, 2002 they certainly were, because in 2002 they'd just gone through 8 years of shell shock. But yes, indeed, that's now that is what Marvel is doing when they're doing overships. DC has decided instead to do limited returnability generally, which is the same essential thing. It's allowing retailers to order more of something and not have to pay for it. The difference is limited returnability of any kind incurs labor. It requires the retailer to keep track of what has to be reported back as unsold, and it requires somebody at the publishing company to verify that and say there's no abuse. Marvel tends to run much tighter in terms historically in terms of what they want to spend time on, and so they go the overship route again. It's all they're both just tactics, but as I say, for us reading it on the outside doing the charts, we can kind of tell when it's happening here, and in some cases, as with the returnability, Diamond specifically tells us.
I'm gonna pause though for a second to just address the conspiracy nature of this thing. So I've watched these videos and they go out there, oh man, the SJW crew at Marvel is trying to pump up their numbers, so they're massively overshipping Iceman to try and say that it's going to sell when it doesn't sell. When what you're saying is that in reality, this is an attempt not to obfuscate sales numbers, but to try and to think that perhaps under ordering in this oversaturated market is causing lower sales, so they want to find a ceiling for the actual sales.
The charts are not anywhere near important enough in the scheme of things to cause a publisher to want to spend a lot of money. But believe me, I mean, I worked for a publishing company for a decade and a half before I got here. We just didn't do that. It's not something that but what we did do is we did very frequently do things where we would ship a lot of extra copies of this or that to this market or that market as experiments,
Especially if you believe something is underordered, right? If you believe there's a potential maybe that's untapped or not recognized.
And the trick is simply not to do it in a situation where it costs the retailer time and money. In the book trade, this is called channel stuffing. And in fact, that is what ended up killing the book that's immediately behind me here, the Standard Catalog of Comic Books, because the company that published us was caught in the middle of a lawsuit after the first private equity firm that bought us sold us to the second private equity firm that bought us, and the second private equity firm accused the first firm of channel stuffing with our book while they were auditing the value of the company.
To inflate the value of the company,
and they ended up having to settle out of court. There was $100 million lawsuit between two private equity firms, largest one ever that had ever happened at that point. And again, that they settled. But one of the casualties of it was that, indeed, there were, the fourth volume of the Standard Catalog of Comic Books was shipped in colossal numbers. But again, it's different. It's different in comics. It's different in comics.
Let's get back to our numbers. I think we were right here at the end of 2017 or right mid 2017.
That's right. And so, what happens is we get to the end of 2017, the beginning of 2018. I begin detecting that there's a change in the trajectory of the sales. Things are leveling off. I don't want to use, this is not a good time to be using flatten the curve metaphors. But I saw that
understand what it means, at least.
Yeah, I saw that. Looking at some of the internal numbers, I could see that we had found a bottom. And so we get to 2019, or rather, we get to 2018. We get into the month of April. We get Action Comics 1000. One of the things that drives the comics market is when we have these big hits like that, where you've got a book that's and we'll advance to the next slides here, I think. When you've got a book that Action 1000 accounts for $500,000 all on its own, or not $500,000. I'm sorry, scratch that. 500,000 copies at $10 each, or actually that was $8 each. That's $4 million. Then you've got Detective 1000, which is $10. That's a $5 million book. You've got Amazing Spider-Man 800 in there. Every one of these things is kicking out about $5 million. That money is not being, some of it is coming from other books, but a lot of it is coming from new orders outside the store. A lot of it is coming from retailers bringing in dollars that had been on the sidelines that they weren't going to put in. A lot of it is stores that are diversified will take money that was in their Funkos or their games or their whatever else, and they'll move it back into comics, or they won't buy as many graphic novels that month. They'll move it into comics. So what happens? The direct market, one of the main things that happens with the direct market is because it's a subscription-based business, this month tends to look like last month. Last month tends to look like the previous month. So when you have poor cash flow, things don't improve quickly. When you have strong cash flow, hits build on hits, and that's what we saw in 2011. That's what we saw in with Star Wars and Secret Wars in the mid 2010s, and that's what we began to see a virtuous cycle developing in 2018, early 2019, and so we'll look ahead to the next 2 years of relative changes, and the arrows start to turn up. And in fact, by the time you get to the summer of 2019, and you've got House of X, Powers of X happening, and you've got Marvel starting to get that part of its franchise underway again. We get our first double-digit increase quarter to quarter since that earlier period at the end of 2019. And so that's kind of where we were. And it's why when we're talking about the beginning to 2020, I say it's a case of before and after, because the orders had been improving relative year to year. And again, this is always aggregate. Your individual store performance is going to vary. Half of everything is below average. Half of everything is above average.
Right.
So everything is going to be, different, a different universe depending on where you were. We're talking about the average. We're talking about the aggregate together. And what we'll see is that we get into the first quarter, and this is the report that we just finished with the March sales charts on Comichron, and we'll see that if you were to look at the last 3 months, last month, where we just had December through February, well, those months were up 4% versus the previous year in total orders. But if you look at January through March 2020, you've got March in there, and we go down 4%. And a number of things are happening there. That's because during March, you've got, first, comic shops in various parts of the country closing down or parking their accounts or having to close their doors to foot traffic. And then as we get further into the month, we actually have a stoppage of supply coming in because other parts of the sale, other parts of the supply chain are going out. Basically, as soon as Transcontinental, DC's printer, closes at the end of March, that's game. That's all you can do if you're in the business until you get that rectified. And so what we saw was a month in March. Those numbers finally came out here at the end of April.
Are you ready for the next slide here?
Yeah, here we go. And that takes the entire thing for the quarter. Comic books themselves, this is in dollars, and dollars are what matter the most to us looking, trying to compare the business across time. 5.5% down. Graphic novels are in better shape. Graphic novels actually had a colossal year outside of the direct market in the book channel last year. I want
to pause for 1 second on that because I want to ask you what your sales charts on graphic novels are strictly direct market.
Yeah, that's
is that correct?
That's strictly direct market. We do an annual report with ICV2, which brings in the book channel. It brings in basically everything that's in BookScan, and then a lot of the book channel, which is not in BookScan, which is like Scholastic runs book fairs, and that's a huge deal. We're talking tens of millions of dollars in that market. There's a whole lot of other stuff that we've added. I've also always included what little newsstand sales there are left. We folded crowdfunding in there last year. We've
talk about that for a second. Talk about how you did your crowdfunding numbers and what. That's
Milton Greep, who's my partner at ICV2. He's done interviews with the heads of Kickstarter and various other places. And then we've taken a look at some of these places, and we've tried to interpret, what portion of the sales is actually likely going to books as opposed to going to the experience or going to sketches or other additions that if this was part of sales in the comics industry, we wouldn't count it because it's merchandise. This was eventually why I think they moved in the diamond charts. It used to be that in the diamond charts, one of the top publishers every month was Eagle Moss, which published the magazines with the action figures. Yeah, well, those were expensive, and that always made it like the number 8 or number 9 publisher of comics, or publisher of print in comics. And it's not it's not apples to apples at that point.
I think what you're saying here, correct me if I'm wrong, is that all the tiers and the premium bonus stuff that they add to these to these crowdfunded projects are not strictly speaking comics, so it's a little tough to calculate dollars to dollars a comparison of crowdfunding versus it's difficult. It's still a significant amount.
it's an amount that, if we were to try to go back across time, would be very difficult to figure out, because what it is technically, it's mail order. Mail order has been part of, as a channel. Mail order has been a channel in comics, going back to the, certainly going back to the undergrounds. And Comics Buyer's Guide was full of ads of comics where you could order them either direct from the publisher, or it would be even from the creator themselves. I got my start doing mini comics, small press comics back in high school. That's all part of the same economy. It's been very difficult, really, until you had something like the crowdfunding starting, where you could actually see some dollar figures. You weren't even able to take a shot at it.
John, we got a comment here from Adam Post. He's a crowdfunding comics guy, and they want to mention, these guys, a lot of these folks talking on here talk about, they usually, a lot of them use Indiegogo compared to Kickstarter. That's why I talk about crowdfunded comics as opposed to a specific crowdfunding platform, and there's even others beyond those. Any way that there's like, you could, crowdfunded people could reach out to you to give you some numbers? Could we incorporate those?
We put it in the annual category because it's much more transparent annually. It's much easier to figure out annually. And again, we just started it, and it's really been more. We kind of have our territories that we deal with, and it's kind of more Milton's beat at ICB2.
Just to tell you the truth, I want to know unified.
Well, the thing to keep
selling in which of these channels, bookstores, DM, crowdfunding.
The thing to keep in mind here with regards to my time and with Comichron is it's always a balancing act. To an extent, reporting on the current comics is a necessity, but I have spent most of this shutdown working on the 1960s. I have spent most of this shutdown. I've built the Rosetta Stone, which has allowed me to actually. I'm going to be able to put a good guess on how many copies of Fantastic Four 1 there were, on a number of things which are really important historically, and so it does come down to basically. Calling your shots, picking and choosing how much time you want to spend on things. In the case of the annual charts every year, part of the reason that they come out so late in the year is that it takes, between Milton and me, studying the various sectors of the business, it takes a good while. The latest charts we have up for that are 2018. We can tell you it's almost certain the 2019 number will be up. It's also almost certain that print will be, but it is certain the print number will be over $1 billion for the entire print North American market industry wide. But we were at 995 million for print last year in 2018. So that's not hard.
Okay,
so
let's
anyway,
keep going. Let's keep going. Let's close out our 2020, and then we can wrap it up with a little bit of general talk.
So what's happening here? What I found when I looked at this, and this is. Do
you want this slide, John?
Yeah, right here. It may be difficult to see, but it's on the March page in Comichron. People can enlarge if they want to see it there. What happened is that every winter. We usually call the winter the dead quarter, or we used to, because publishers just wouldn't put anything out. They would assume that people can't get to the stores. There's going to be interruptions of supply because of northeasters or whatever, and people are not going to get there. So historically, the first quarter has been lighter. I have said many times that how well the first quarter did is usually not a great indicator of how the year is going to go, because a great April can usually repair a terrible winter, and a bad April can undo a great winter, just because the volume in the winter, the sales volume is lower. The new release volume is lower. And what happened is that was all baked in by the time we got to March. Those books were still coming out on schedule, or they were as they intended to. And so we got more books coming out each week in March to the point where the last week of March actually had the biggest slate. It's like 125 comics that came out that month or that week. The problem was there weren't stores open at that point, or most stores weren't open at that point. And so where we see, if we're looking at these charts, if you're just looking at the charts year versus year, you'd say you're down 15% for the month. If you're looking March versus February, March, just as many comics were shipped in March as were shipped in February. It was almost exactly the same. Both months were $37 million months.
I mean, do you think there's anything towards that? Like, we haven't really seen the true impact on sales yet?
We haven't, and that's where our next slide comes in.
Okay.
This is where we started to see the impact. This is the average sales per new release per week, and so if you look at that chart, you'll see that as the stores start to get busier, as the releases that are put out start to get more important, they start bumping up. And then we get to the beginning of March, and it just starts going down from there. And even though there was more volume shipped in the last week of March than any other week in the month, because more comic books came out in the last week of March than any week in 2020, the average number of copies ordered of them had gotten to the lowest point of the last 2 months. And that was in part because retailers are able to adjust their orders.
Yes.
And also, once we get into March, you start having retailers putting their accounts on hold and saying, we're not going to accept any more shipments. Diamond, we're parking our account.
Yes.
Hold our risk.
Yes.
And so, I do not expect there to be April charts. I do not believe that I haven't been told anything one way or another. As I understand it, Diamond is kind of looking at April and May as a hybrid, and it will, I think it's just one previews for the 2-month period that they're going to be dealing with, so that once they actually restart in May, I'm expecting we'll probably end up with something where it's going to be, whenever reporting starts again, it will certainly not be easily comparable to anything previous. But you couldn't compare one title. The Comichron charts are great at giving you some aggregate information. They're great at giving you relative rankings of titles. One reason we don't do cross-time charts on individual comics is there's just a whole lot of things in there that make it difficult for you to be able to rely on the comparison of one issue of a series with a previous issue of that series, even the previous month. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that these charts are based on a calendar month, and so a book that has 5 weeks to sell, 5 Wednesdays to sell, is going to have more copies sold of it on average than a book that has 4.
Yeah. There's people out there who are not going to understand that point, and who are going to think like, how could it make a big difference? But
there's a lot of noise that's in the charts, and what'll happen is you'll have 2 books, 2 issues of Spider Guide number 7 and 8. Issue 1s will throw that out because issue 1s always sell much more than previous issues for financially valid reasons. But let's say issues 707 and 708, where the issue number shouldn't make any difference. You might have both issues selling exactly the same in the rankings, but it might really be that the 708 sold many more copies than 707. It's just the difference is issue 707 came out the first week of February, or not February, the first week of July, and issue 708 came out the last week of August. And so it only captured 1 week's sales versus the previous issue where it had 4 weeks of sales to capture. And
but so those sales numbers though that you're capturing, does that mean that you're getting aggregate reorder numbers?
We're getting what shipped from the warehouse in the calendar month. So
But then I don't. Then I'm losing you here.
Okay. Yeah.
Why would there be a big difference if it's just what like shipped of the initial orders from
because that
709?
Because let's say that book comes out July 1st, and it's not a hit, but it still gets reorders shipped from Diamond on top of the initial order.
Yes.
July 8th, July 15th,
Yes.
July 22nd, and July 29th. Well, now let's compare that with the August book, which only comes out August 30th. And it only gets 1 week of reorders. But maybe it's the biggest hit ever. And it's got reprints selling boom, 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 boom. But all those reorders, September.
Yeah, I get. Okay, that's sort of what I was alluding to. Is that you're getting aggregate numbers that include reorders, so there's a longer sales window. You're gonna sell more books.
Yeah, I mean, it's right. Basically, it's imagine if it were a football game and one of the quarters had had 20 minutes instead of 15. That's kind of what happens in these situations.
Okay,
so there's a number of allusions, and you were asking about other fields where it's what people are doing. Like I always say that sometimes people will compare this with 538. I was actually around before 538, but I really think that the sort of the spiritual, if you want to call it that, parallel to what I'm trying to do at Comichron is the Elias Sports Bureau and Stats Inc. Those are the companies that keep the baseball, the football, the everything, historical records, and they're not telling the future ever. They're giving you some context when they can. They're trying to say, okay, this is the live ball era of baseball. This is in the steroid era of baseball. There's asterisks here. Oh, this was in 160. There were fewer games in this season. This will be, and so this is kind of stuff that I want to be able to do. I want to be able to say, okay, this is the equivalent of the strike season in baseball or football.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, John, I want to thank you again, because if you're not doing this, I don't see too many other people picking up the baton and doing it, and certainly not with the rigor and the historical context to even know where to look for some of this data. So that is the challenge. And so I've always called the website a resource for historical research, and the stuff that interests me is the conventional wisdoms, the things that we used to think, or the things that we never knew. I've been digging a lot into that data set that goes back to the 1930s, the Audit Bureau of Circulation. And I've been squaring its information up with some of my other sources. And the most interesting thing I found over the last year really is how seasonal comics used to be. I mean, incredibly seasonal. I was just talking about the dead quarter in comics. We have nothing on the 1960s and 70s and before that, where the publishers would just go away for the winter, and they would double up everything in the summer. And you would see, I've now been able to generate, sales charts month to month on a lot of these earlier years. And you want to talk about, your roller coasters. Within a year, it's boom, 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 pow. I mean, it's crazy. Wow.
And I don't think I don't think we had these metrics before. We didn't have these. We couldn't prove it.
Well, and then
so now I'm starting to be able to get to where I can
as well. Made it. It must have been a crapshoot. Everybody talks about what a crapshoot it was to find the next issue of a comic that you wanted. So the direct market, I feel like that's efficiency to that process.
The direct market saved the industry in the 1970s. I mean, we would have been gone. The newsstand market was in wholesale collapse. Newsstands did not want comics. Newsstands only valued comics in the 40s and 50s as a loss leader, as a cheap thing to keep the kids happy and busy while their parents spent the real money. As soon as comics started becoming something where you had censors looking at them in the 1950s, and then in the 1960s, you had television come along to kind of replace comics as the national babysitter. You get to the 1970s. Oh, thank you here on May the 4th day for the person that loves the Kenobi novel. That's
oh yeah.
my next podcast later today is actually a May the 4th podcast.
Man,
that's the day job, is still writing novels and books and comics. But yeah, that's the direct market took waste out of the system, in the sense that publishers were no longer having to print 4 and 5 and 6 copies to sell one, and that is healthy for the business. That is healthy for profits. It means there are profits. There weren't profits for a good while there.
It's healthier for the planet too. Let's not forget all that extra shipping and ripping and pulping and everything else.
Yeah, and nobody claims that it's a perfect system. It's simply I look at it, and again, this is my science fiction hat coming in here again. Carl Sagan said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. I kind of look at it the same way, that any new paradigm that's going to replace what we have now will need to meet some pretty extraordinary requirements to get the buy-in that it will require from everybody involved to make it work. And that doesn't mean that people aren't going to experiment. People are experimenting now, but it's not a given that somebody's going to have a great plan for reorganizing the industry on certain levels and on certain terms, and that everybody's going to adopt it. No, right. These things come from usually bubble up from the direct market came about because there were fans who wanted to put their money where their mouth was, and they did not want to go through the trouble of having to go to horrible lengths to get comics, buying them from stores that did not care how the comics were, whether they got the right ones. I was a spinner rack kid. The people that ran those places loathed the comics. Everybody loves the spinner rack. The spinner rack was literally invented by the Comic Magazine Association of America to give places that were going to drop comics entirely a place to sort of push them off into the corner and not have it take up any useful space. The direct market, was something that came up from within, and we innovated our way out of this problem. Just like in the 90s, I think the way we innovated out of the problem in the 90s, because we had that bubble market in the early 90s. I think the way we innovated out of it was the graphic novel, the collected edition. That allowed us to monetize our past, to monetize our history, and give us something with a shelf life, which has taken the financial burden off the comic book, so that when this comic book comes out in 1961, if this thing didn't make any money, or all of its money when it came out, it never made another dime. Right. Now comics don't have to sell as much per issue. Well, because they make money other ways.
It's pretty interesting because a series of things have happened in the last, I'm going to say 10, but more like 20 years that have really flipped the situation. Back then, we were always talking about, man, we lamented the death of the newsstand because, like you and me, right? That was our entry into comics, right? Yeah. And now people go, where is that? I don't have that anymore. And I'm going to go, we're in a way better situation now.
Oh yeah. There's
schools, libraries, teachers, and then on the early end, and then graduating right into this pop culture stuff of movies, TV shows that is all marinated. We are in a situation we've never been before, where there are comics for every step all the way up to adults only.
In the 90s, the late 90s, when the collapse was going on, that was the last time I really felt like there was an existential threat to the business and to the medium, because there was really no place to get the new readers to learn how to read comics. Because believe it or not, it's something you have to learn how to do. Yes. And in the 30s and 40s, kids learned to read comics from the newspaper, from comic strips. Comics were given away in schools or not in schools, but in shoe stores and big boy restaurants throughout the 50s and 60s. The Catholic Guild did Treasure Chest, a comic book that was handed out, sold in the stores or in the classrooms rather. But once the newsstand collapses and just about everything is off the newsstand, we get into the 90s, we don't really have that training area. Well, this is where the graphic novel is a perfect package for places like Barnes & Noble, where they can't make a go of selling magazines because of the price point. Parents, who was buying comics on the newsstands at the end? It was parents. It was people buying it for their kids usually. And those were the people who were most price resistant. They were the ones most likely to say, oh, I remember this cost 25 cents. And they would reject it. And so that's why near the end, you only had, the Archie digests, selling in that marketplace, because everything else had been rejected in that package by the consumers out there.
And it was all about shelf space, price point.
Exactly. And, and the only reason that the Archies are even in those grocery store spaces is because the Comics Magazine Association of America invented those spaces. The reason you have TV guides in the checkout aisle in the comics, or in the grocery store aisle, is because that shelving area was invented as a place people could pay to be in for the grocery stores by the CMAA years and years ago. The CMAA no longer exists. It's rumored that Archie still has sort of a grandfather deal so that they can still get their digests into there. But anyway, as I say, the format just didn't work for those outside venues anymore. But when you're talking about a graphic novel, you're now talking about something where, people are used to going into Barnes & Noble and paying $20 for a book that's in color, and they don't reject that. And so, it becomes a package that's large enough that you can sell it through the mail and make a profit on it in a way that you can't do necessarily on a single issue of something.
There's a lot of pieces to it too, putting it on a bookshelf, just the perceived value of what you get out of a book format graphic novel, a $7.95 Scholastic graphic novel, compare that to, say, buying two periodical comics. There's a, whether you think that it's a good deal or not, the perception of value is very different.
So it changes everything. And so, I guess that's what I say. It's a case of us, it did in part come from the top, in the sense that DC in particular helped the direct market and helped the graphic novel market along by committing to it so early. They committed to it in the 80s. And just the same way that Marvel committed to the direct market by making sure people had cash registers.
I mean, DC owned the graphic novels in the bookstore, as you're saying, since the 80s. They had that prominent space but they sought an adult audience. They were seeking to legitimize what was viewed by many as a kiddie medium, a juvenile medium, and give it an adult cachet. Whereas the genius was to flip it. Now you had to flip it around because everybody in the 90s thought comics are too mature. They are too dark. They are too scary. My kid can't read Batman. I need something different, right?
Well, and so, we start having stuff, directed for that audience, that is custom made for that audience. A big thing that helped in those markets to create spaces for us in Barnes & Noble was manga, and the fact that was a hit in the late 2000s as opposed to the 2010s. All these things, I am in the past business. I'm not in the future business. Yes. I have always said, though, that having, just as in your store, diversifying helped you in the 1990s to survive what happened to the comics business. Magic the Gathering saved comic shops in 1994.
Pokemon did.
Pokemon in '99 again. I used to run Scry magazine, so that was one of those things that retailers that were able to go to some of those other those other ports in the storm, were able to survive. But I think that once we start going forward here, it's going to be a different kind of a recovery, because this is much more. It is literally a natural disaster, and I can't predict based on anything that's happened in the past. I've gone back and looked at I've looked at the UPS strike in 1997. I've gone back to try to detect shipping problems because of the blizzard of '93 and various other things. There's nothing on this level that has impacted stores and publishers and everybody alike. Things are going to be spinning up at different parts at different times. The metaphor I used that was in your Steve Jeppy video the other day is this is like Apollo 13. We're going to have to try to restart systems that were never designed to stop.
Yes.
And various when the music stopped, money is in different places, and various people were at different places in their supply situations. Again, it's every store is different. Every store's universe. Every store's reality is going to be different based on what their specific needs are. And this is always my thing is people say we need to do this or that to the direct market. Well, it's like, which direct market, which market? Because the recovery is going to happen different places in different states at different speeds because of the event. But also different stores' exposure to it is going to differ based on what their percentages are in new comics versus graphic novels versus toys versus other things, and how are those sectors impacted? I don't follow all of those.
There's a lot of people don't even think about that for many stores out there that carry comics. Comics are one sideline. They're not necessarily a comic specialty shop. There's something else that carries comics, as well as toys and games, and whatever.
I mean, it's a very different world. I mean, the comic shop that's closest to me is a comic shop, game shop, sandwich shop. So I love that. It does gourmet sandwiches. So and I don't know that there's another store like it.
Yeah. I had a concept for one. I mean, please tell me they're called Hero Sandwiches.
No, that's Galaxy Comics Games and More in
they blew it on the name, but
I think he built the sign before he built the sandwich stand. But it's a gourmet sandwich stand, and again, it's a great idea in the sense that with the gamers, you've got a captive audience and hungry audience. But but again, Sean, what each individual store's exposure to this is going to be very different, and so it's hard to detect, and it will be hard to detect. I don't know that I'm going to be able to look at the numbers from 2020 and really know for sure what happened until we get a good deal later into it.
Well, but here's the thing, everybody out there, we need John. He can't just do this by himself. He needs some support. Okay. So what you can do is you can go to Patreon, right? And you can look up Comichron, and you can sign up as a patron. John, why don't you tell them what they'll get from that?
Right now, I had just started the thing basically as a tip jar to have there, because again, it's not something that I've ever run. I'm not organized enough to be a nonprofit. I'm not. It is literally something I do between writing chapters of my books. So it's something where, though it does cost money to run the site, it does cost money to order copies of Sad Sack and the Sarge. A significant cost comes from and there's a post on there right now where I'm archiving all of the distributor catalogs ever, or trying to. And these are big collections that require heavy-duty shelving units. I have
You're talking about like previews catalogs for the past 20 years?
Yeah.
So like 1 year of previews is going to take up a 50 pounds of.
Well, you'll see. It's more. You'll see some of the photos on the Patreon. But I ended up. I got the books that I was collecting from the distributors. When Capital City went out of business, I got their library or part of it. When Comics Buyer's Guide went out of business, I ended up getting a good part of their library. And it's taken a long time to integrate. Some of this stuff is going to end up online. Not a lot of it. I'm not going to sit there scanning in 500-page catalogs. Although fortunately, Diamond has done that with most of its catalogs. But anyway, it's
there's some technology out there I've been seeing lately coming out that to automate that kind of stuff. But that's another topic, guys. What I want to say is go to Patreon. Put a couple of bucks in the jar for John Jackson. A lot of you loudmouths out there in the comments are talking about what experts you are, right? Well, I got a real expert right here, okay? This guy has put decades of his life compiling information that is super helpful to many aspects of the industry. So, guys, come on.
That's Patreon.
Show a little bit of love to John Jackson Miller.
Patreon/Comichron, Comichron, and of course the Twitter is Twitter Comichron, Comichron, and then also Facebook Comichron. If I could pick up a question that's here on the live comments real quick before we go out. Someone has asked me a question as a writer, and I know I'm here with the archivist hat, but he's asking about. This is actually kind of related to comics. Okay, he's asking about. There we go. The write for the trade paperback format.
Good, okay.
Writing for the trade. What we found in the sales chart side of it, what we found is one of the reasons everybody's going, why is issue 1 sales way up here and issue 2, 3, 4 down here? Well, part of it is the dynamic that's a collectible thing. That's obvious that's a thing. But it's been aggravated by the trade paperback because we have the trade waiters who will sample the first issue. And they will just get issue 1, also kind of knowing that if any issue of this is going to end up being, valuable, it'll be this one. And so it's more valuable than the others. As a writer, it's a real challenge because you're trying to write a serialized story that functions both in the individual issue chunks and then also as an overall storyline. And the only equivalent that I've been able to do to that in terms of my prose writing, in terms of my novels, I wrote a serial novel called Overdraft that I need to get back into print. Science fiction novel, and it was something where we would send people on Amazon. They'd get 8-chapter episodes every 2 weeks. And I was having them to do sort of the same thing I have to do with comics, which is the chapters have to kind of feel like they've got a beginning, middle, and end, like an episode of a TV series, despite the fact that when they're actually read as a group, look, 90% of the quote graphic novels that are in bookstores were serialized first. And it's one reason why the periodical needs to continue to exist. Because it allows us who are writing these books to make a living while instead of going away for a year and doing 120 pages of art. It subsidizes and it also advertises the book as it's being developed.
It in mind, gives it a primacy, an urgency as it's coming out. Yeah. Lets you get feedback faster from your fans. There's a lot of advantage to serialization.
I mean, the novels that we look at as novels, Charles Dickens and Sherlock Holmes, those were all originally serialized in magazines to begin with. Charles Dickens was actually serialized in a newsletter that he did, and you don't think that the book channel, that the booksellers there, you don't think they wouldn't love to be able to sell individual issues of the new whatever it is novel as it's going out and making money from it at the same time. This is a strength of our business. We have inherited the serialized fiction history that came from the pulp magazines, that came from Amazing Stories, and where Asimov's Foundation came from, and all of that. And it's just, yes, it is a challenge when you're writing it to try to kind of you have that notion that this is going to play for somebody one way and in the real time, and it's going to play for somebody else another completely different way as they're reading it all in one thing. Yes. I remember controversies having to do with individual issues of series that I did of Knights of the Old Republic, but also these things are always happening with current comics now, where there will be a controversy about an event in issue 38 of something, and the publisher will just want to say, or the creator will just want to say, just wait, because once the book comes out, nobody will ever remember except for you that this was a problem.
Well, I do think that there is room like for two approaches, because one of the flip side of that, to me, the limiting factor of serialization, especially with comics, is that each chapter ends up being a rigid amount of pages, and there's a formulaicness, there's a pacing problem, there's a restating of information problem. Oh yeah. It's like when you read the old Spider-Man comic strip, and the first and the last panel are the same as the previous day. You know what I mean? Like there's a issue when it's collected.
When a publisher comes to me and says, pitch a story, and I pitch the story, I go to them, I have to find out the most interesting or most important part. How many issues are we talking about? I think for Dynamite, I did a Galactica thing for the 40th anniversary, and it ended up being 5 issues plus a 0-issue prelude. And I had to sit there and figure out, well, how is the tempo of this thing going to go? There's always this 3-act structure, as they say to movies. Yes. Well, how do you do a 5-act plus 1? That's a different animal. And so, so the tempo sort of is a bit different, but they're dealing with that in episodic television too. Is this with now that we've got all the streaming services, this is going to be 8 episodes or 10 episodes or however long. And now we're actually seeing that because they're freed from television, they're actually able to go long on an episode if they need to.
Yes.
And although actually increasingly that doesn't seem to matter. I mean, what did they do with Better Call Saul's last 2 or 3 episodes? They went past the hour. They're not. I think a lot of what we used to consider these standards is changing. And in particular with comics, what I would like to see is, first of all, I always feel more pages is always good. I think the format change that we do that is the most dangerous is reducing the page count. And that's been done it's been done many times over the course of comics history to keep costs down. But going from 22 to 20 pages, that's also something that happened about a decade ago, which was not helpful.
Not a great idea to remove even more perceived value from a package that's perceived as overpriced and not. But when you compare a single issue of a comic costs you about as much as a month of Disney Plus, there's a disconnect in value.
But if there's a way to make it feasible for because it's not just the writer, it's the artist and everybody else. If there's a way to make it feasible to do 24 pages or 25 pages of some issues and not necessarily for others as needed, I think that would be a good thing if we could try and figure out a way to just make sure that the math makes sense. Because it all comes down to that. Again, having been on the publishing end of this, it all comes down to who's going to write the check. For this particular thing, where in the budget is the money for those pages going to come from? But again, it's just something that's changed over the years, and it's it used to be when I was writing those Star Wars comics in Knights of the Old Republic in the beginning, I was actually planning for where the ads would appear.
The best writers in comics do that, though.
Yeah.
They're aware of when a page is going to turn to do a reveal, as opposed to being a page that you're going to see. Those things are really underestimated and very little thought about in the commercial writing of comic books.
Yeah.
But man, John,
oh no, I look at those,
a lot of things.
I do a slideshow at conventions on scripting, and I do breakdowns of comics.
Okay, John, I'm sorry, we are about out of time here.
Yeah, we gotta go. But
I know you got to go. You have other streams to go to. You're coming.
I've got to go. I've got to go to the May the 4th be with you. But yeah, this has been great.
I want you. We know you're going to come. You're come back in 3 months and do the next quarterly roundup for sure. Maybe sometime between then or after that, we'll bring you in just to talk about your writing and your comics work and all that stuff. Because man, you got a lot to say about that. I want to thank you for your time today. John, if you have a second, stick around. I'm just going to wrap it up here, or if you got to go, I'll talk to you soon.
No, I can stick. Thank you, and thank everybody listening. Comics are coming back. It's a business that's been 85 years. We've been through a lot. There's 10 billion comics physically out there right now. We'll find something to read until the end of May.
Okay, thanks, John. And thank you, world, for watching this thing. If you can't tell, this thing is a passion play for me. I'm happy to say this is the very first new video I've dropped since I've been monetized. So when you guys watch this stuff, you're helping to support my channel in a small way. And I hope to take all that money and put it back into the channel and into new comics and into helping other people as well and helping bookstores. We've got another Steve Jeppy live stream coming up this Wednesday. He's going to talk with publishers, and he's going to try and give the same kind of reassurances he was able to give to his retail partners, to his publisher partners, because he's got to deal with both sides of that equation. I want to thank everybody for watching. If you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Maybe hit that bell thingamajig for some notifications, and you'll find out when we're going to drop new videos. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching, and keep reading comics. We're coming back from this thing, and we're going to be stronger than ever.